And when you study for the exam, I think it's useful for you to have that in front. So what I'm going, but let's do that cooperatively. So you ask me questions, comments, and stuff. So I don't need just to read these things because it's not particularly useful. But for example, when I mentioned, for example, how is Gini calculated? So that could come up in a question, not as a question like how is Gini calculated, but it could be related to something else. And the important part to know there is these are the bilateral comparisons. You remember when I said actually if I want to calculate the Gini of this class, I have to take my income against your income, your income, your income, and everybody, and then I have to take Guy's income against everybody else, and so forth. So that's the idea, is actually bilateral comparisons, then they're divided by the number of such comparisons, and divided by the mean. The mean is plays an important role because it is actually the normalizing factor. Because if you drop the mean, then you have the Gini coefficient which doesn't have a scale, so it becomes so-called absolute Gini coefficient. But because you divide everything by the mean, you actually make sure that the Gini stays, remember that, between 0 and 1. So these are things, so that's why actually the next issue is absolute versus relative measure. So Gini obviously is a relative measure, but it's relative because we do it with divided by the mean. We could also have for each of these measures, we can have absolute, but as you know, the downside of absolute measures is that you then, if you have a growth of the economy and everybody's incomes goes up, the absolute distances between us can increase very easily, and actually normally they do increase. And then the absolute measure of inequality, while it may be useful because maybe it is actually a good measure since it shows you the real gap in income, it will be driven essentially by growth. So that's the downside. And you have the whole, one of these excursi in my book is about that. So is the difference between relative and absolute measures of inequality clear? Mm-hmm. Absolute is simply something that actually adds up very simply, kind of adds up all the absolute distances between us. But if I want to have a relative measure, that measure should not depend on our incomes, should only depend on the ratio of our incomes. And you achieve that by taking all these distances and dividing it by the mean. So that's the basic idea is that actually that you should really focus on the percentage gaps, if you will, because that's the relative stuff. Okay, broad values of the Gini coefficient we have seen it even in today's presentation on Venezuela. So actually, if you remember some of the numbers, obviously if you're in the range of the 60s, you're really very, very high, but you're not going to find countries below 25. So that's the basic range, yes. Yeah.
Can you just talk about what's the overlap component? Thing you mentioned. What is?
Yes, where is it? It must be so. So the overlap component is in the Gini coefficient, and it comes from the fact that the Gini cannot be decomposed by recipients, what is called exactly. So in other words, you cannot decompose. Let me go to the example of the classroom. So let's suppose I want to calculate the inequality on this floor. The problem with the Gini is that when I calculate all inequality on this floor, I put everybody together, treat them everybody equally, and then I say, okay, how much is due to inequalities within each of the classrooms, and how much it is due to inequality between richer classrooms versus poorer classrooms. A measure like tail would decompose that exactly. So it would say, okay, the total number is 100, 60 is due to inequalities within classrooms, 40 due to inequality to the fact that there are some average income in this classroom is higher than average income over there. Gini cannot do that. Gini actually can give you three kind of, origins. One would be inequality within each classroom. The second part would be the difference in the mean incomes between the classrooms. And the third part, which is the overlap, would be the part which would be a sort of fed or explained by the fact that some people in this classroom, which is richer than the next classroom, would have lower income with somebody in that classroom, which is actually poor. Let's
One
go
more
to
time,
Gates.
that last one, one more
Oh,
time.
I know. The overlap is that overlap appears. Input later. Overlap would not appear if everybody in this classroom, which is richer classroom by definition, would be richer than somebody over there. Not somebody, than everybody there. So we are all richer. Even the poorest person in this classroom is richer than the richest person in the other classroom. If you think of the US versus Congo, there is almost no overlap because everybody in the US is better off than everybody in Congo. So there is no overlap. So the overlap appears when some people in Congo are actually better off than some people in the US. So that's where the overlap would come. So our overlap is very useful. Actually, some people like myself prefer the Gini because this overlap shows you how much the countries in the global income distribution, how much the distributions kind of overlap, as it were. So there is a common point between them. Because in the very nice decomposition of tail, you cannot tell that at all. But here in the Gini you can. And I think it's an important additional sort of advantage of Gini. But of course, some people, it's not universally accepted. Some people like the neatness of the decomposition. But you should know what the overlap is, because it really plays, as I said, really an important role. To give you another example, I think I actually mentioned that you take the European Union 15, like all the rich countries in the European Union, when European Union was relatively limited, it didn't get extended to the east. The overlap there will be large because you cannot, when you put all the Germans and French together, they are not going to be separated by income, with all Germans being richer and all French being poor. So there will be lots of overlap between them. But when you put, for example, together France and, or let's suppose the Netherlands and Bulgaria, you will have very little of, much less overlap, because most of the Dutch would be richer than most of the Bulgarians. So there will be some overlap, but not very much. So that's the same idea. And so it does have a certain advantage because it does actually have that kind of neat component. If there was a world which actually where nation state didn't matter and every mean income of the nation state were the same and so on, you would actually have a huge overlap. It would just not matter where you're born or who you are. So that's why I'm using it. Okay, so that's the, well, I already explained the composition. I simply mentioned that one should know, it's not very important, but one should know that the composition by income source is, however, exact. In other words, when I decompose it by recipients, as I was saying now, there is overlap between, if there is no full correspondence that everybody who is in Germany is richer than everybody who is in Bulgaria, then there is an overlap. But when I talk about the composition by income source, you take the same Gini coefficient and say how much is due to inequality of labor, how much to inequality of capital, as you were saying today. There is, it decomposes exactly. It says, okay, the total Gini in this class is 100, and then how much is due to inequality in labor and how much is due to inequality in capital. Remember, I mean, one thing, it's not going to come to an exam, so I will be very brief on that because it's really not an important point for this class. But the difference is that in one case of the composition by recipients, I take all of our income, it's the total income, and compare each of us to each other. In the decomposition by source, I don't take my total income. I say how much of my income is labor, how much of my income is capital. And then I compare our labor incomes among ourselves, and then I compare our capital incomes among ourselves. So you know the units are different. Imagine like ourselves being divided into half. Half is capital, half is labor. And I'm comparing only these halves amongst each of us. But in the decomposition by recipient, I take myself as a full person and compare myself to somebody else. So there are these two different decompositions. But you know, really, it is by source is not important for us. It's much more important for us by recipient. So don't be confused about that. But really, the overlap is important because of the reasons that I explained in global inequality. Okay. Anything else on this, or shall I move to PPPs? Okay, so PPPs is really basically differences in price levels. And why it is important for us, because without PPPs, we really cannot, and that's really could also be an exam question, part of the exam question. We cannot really compare welfare of people in different countries because I can do it with exchange rate, but then I would be really underestimating real welfare of people who live in countries with lower price level. So I really need it. It's really an indispensable component of what we do. And then for 2011 PPPs, you should know that, of course, we talked about a big difference with 2005, but what they did for our purposes, they actually estimated the Asian, in particular Chinese and Indian price level lower than 2005. And then there is this logic. If the price level is lower, that means that incomes in that country are higher. And why? Because you register income in local currency, that's a given. So this guy has, 100 rupees. And then you say, okay, but how much is it? 100 rupees. And if the price level is estimated lower, then the 100 rupees would look a bigger amount when expressed in US dollars. In US purchasing power dollars, which means US PPP dollars. Because you remember, you have from household survey, you have a given number in local currency. So that is not going to change. What is going to change is how much that number is worth in the US, because US is used as a numeraire, so that actually price level in the United States is 1. So how much is it worth here? And if I estimate India's price level lower now than before, then obviously it's going to give a bigger boost to people's income of people in India. So that's important. And then what would it do for global inequality if these poorer countries get a bigger boost? So the population from those countries would be actually relatively better off, and that means the global inequality will go down. So that's where the link between PPPs and global inequality comes in. And that's an important link, and that's why we are studying PPPs. Because if with new PPPs, I have a boost of income of people in poor countries, then clearly inequality, global inequality is going to be less. Now you can tell me it is purely measurement thing, which is true, but that measurement has a meaning to it, attached meaning to it. Because presumably we can estimate better the price level now than we did it in 2005. So that's basic. Any questions on PPP? PPPs that's definitely going to come in one way or another in the exam because it's really a crucial component and to some extent harder to kind of figure out or understand even than household surveys. Household surveys are, household surveys. You field them, you get the data on income, consumption. But PPPs are really important because they are global. So they actually have to convert those incomes into something else. So poor countries and their price levels. Okay, we did that. Functional versus personal income distribution. We know that actually from Ruhama's presentation today. Functional is capital versus labor. Personal is what we're doing in this class. Individuals. Disposable income versus market income. I think you will remember that disposable is really what we want to do. But this market is before, as the name says, before you come to the redistribution. In other words, pre-state. Yeah. Yes, Caroline.
What about income concentration versus income?
Yes. Okay, that's a good point. Income inequality obviously is what we do in the class. Income concentration is really the measures that are used by Piketty and the others, is the shares of the top 1% share of top. It's important to realize the difference. It's difference, and that's why the term is concentration is more accurate, because that measure does not take into account at all what happens to the rest of the distribution. It simply grabs the top 1% or top 10% and says how much do they have compared to the overall. But it doesn't take into account at all what this overall, how the overall may be distributed. So you take the top 1%, so they get, let's suppose, 18% of GDP. But you don't at all answer the question, how is the rest, whatever, 82% of GDP being distributed? And inequality measure, in principle, takes everybody into account. So that's the difference. And it's an important difference because, it could be that the 82% is equally distributed, or it could be that 82% is very unequally distributed. And that measure concentration will not tell you that. And that is related, why should I put it together, to fiscal data versus